Okay, good afternoon everybody. The brief I was given for this was really to talk to you about apprenticeships right from the beginning. I accept that some of you, in fact, could we just have a show of hands from the employers that are in the room? How many of you currently engage with apprentices? Okay, so we've got some there. I would say certainly for those people that currently do work with apprentices, some of the things I'm saying are already going to be second nature to you, but think about the points that you can share when we have the question and answer session at the end, perhaps sharing some of your good experiences or perhaps some of your less positive experiences if that's happened for the benefit of the rest of the group. Just a little bit about SIGTA. So SIGTA is a training organisation. We work throughout Sussex and Surrey. And we were actually set up back in 1964. And very interestingly, that's when the Apprenticeship Levy, when the Training Levy, the first time round, actually existed with the Industrial Training Act. So they say things do go round and come round again. We provide services very heavily involved in apprentice training, particularly in the engineering and manufacturing sector. So that includes a very broad range of engineering apprenticeships, particularly at intermediate and advanced apprenticeship level. We also provide other training through apprenticeships in areas like business administration, warehousing and storage to support the engineering employers that we work with. But certainly our real bread and butter is in the engineering qualifications. We also provide short training courses to industry, training programs to community and unemployed learners, and also a lot of training advice and guidance. And it's perhaps worth saying, as we go through the presentation today, if you're an employer that's thinking of engaging with apprentices and you haven't done it yet, if anything we're talking about sounds complicated, sounds difficult, then please remember that probably all the training providers that are out there will be very happy to provide that training advice and guidance to support you throughout the process. And SIGTA, finally, we're set up as a not-for-profits organisation. We're a group training association, which means very much that we're supported by local employers. Local employers make up our non-executive board and steer and shape the services that we provide. And in fact, my wife David Barbrook is sitting over there. We actually have one of our non-executive directors in the room. So the key areas then that I'm going to talk about today is really what is the Apprenticeship Levy and how does that work? What is an apprenticeship? And I know clearly we've all got a definition of what we think an apprentice would be, but it's probably worth just unpicking that a little bit. To think about what actually an apprentice is today, the broad range of roles that an apprenticeship could actually cover. Also, perhaps how to decide if apprentices are correct for your organisation. And finally, how to get started, or for those employers that are already engaged with apprenticeships, how you might be able to expand that further if in fact that's right for your business. So let's get stuck in then with the Apprenticeship Levy. So the Apprenticeship Levy is a tax on UK employers to fund your apprenticeships. And I think the important thing with that, for those employers that pay the levy, it is a tax. You pay it whether you train apprentices, whether you don't train apprentices. It's now a tax that's been imposed on the business. And the levy came into effect on the 6th of April 2017 from the point of view of companies that were in scope starting to pay the levy, but it actually started in terms of funding apprenticeships from the 1st of May 2017. And the levy is charged at 0.5% of an employer's UK pay bill. I'm not going to go into great detail this afternoon how you define the pay bill, but that's certainly something that we can talk about outside the session. But suffice to say that the levy is based on 0.5% of your UK pay bill. And each employer receives a £15,000 allowance to offset against their payment. Right? So just like a personal tax allowance, it's only an allowance. You're never going to see that £15,000 in hard cash, but it's an allowance that offsets against the levy. So what that means is that the levy is only paid on annual pay bills over £3 billion. Right? And the logic there is that 0.5% of 3 billion is 15,000. So if you have a payroll of less than £3 billion, then you won't currently be paying the levy. Okay, so examples of what you'll pay, just to make the maths work there. So we can see an employer that would pay the levy with a pay bill of £5 million. So 0.5 of 5 million gives us 25,000. Subtracting the £15,000 allowance will leave us with £10,000. So that employer with their £5 million pay bill would actually be paying £10,000 a year in apprentice levy. And if in the second example we look at an employer that wouldn't need to pay the levy, we can see here an example, a £2 million pay bill, and as we can see there, if you apply 0.5% to that, we end up with a £10,000 levy, but we can deduct from that the £15,000 allowance, which cancels it out, so therefore that employer wouldn't be paying the apprentice levy. And it's probably worth noting that because obviously the levy now exists in legislation, clearly the percentage, the 0.5%, is a figure that in future years could change. And clearly it could change either way, bringing more employers in scope to pay the levy or putting more out of scope. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about connected companies, but we probably need to mention it. So where a group of employers are connected, they'll only be able to use one £15,000 allowance. So if you're a group of companies, but within that group your UK pay bill exceeds the £3 million, then as a group of companies you'll be in scope for the levy. Okay, so thinking at the moment specifically about levy paying employers, and can I just ask, from the people in the room that know, how many of you would fall in scope as levy payers? Okay. And as we would expect, that would be the minority, because by the government's calculation, it's currently only 2% of UK employers that are actually going to be in scope for the levy. So, as we've already said then, the levy applies to all UK employers, but importantly, funds available to spend are based on the pay bill percentage of employees that live in England. Right, so if you had two sites, you employ 80% of your employees with their costs in England, 20% in Scotland, you pay your levy on that combined percentage, but the money that the government will give you back to go into your levy fund is based only on the English percentage. Right? And that works because of the devolved administrations. Scotland, Wales run their own apprenticeship systems, so some of that money gets pulled off into those regions. Okay, so levy paid employers can create an account on the apprenticeship service, and by creating that account, it allows you to administer and spend the funds that have been allocated to you through the levy. And you can use the apprenticeship services account, first of all, to receive your funds. You can use it to select and pay training and assessment providers, stop and pause those payments if you need to, and to manage your apprentices. Now, as a levy paying employer, through that account that you can set up, once you've signed the Education Skills Funding Agency's contract and you can use it, you can do everything you need to run your apprenticeship scheme from the point of view of accessing your funding, selecting apprenticeship frameworks and standards, finding training providers. But again, as I said, we hinted at the beginning, you don't need to go it alone, because you can actually talk to a training provider that will assist you with an awful lot of that and help step you through the process. Now, very positively, if you are a levy-paying employer, the government will contribute 10% to the monthly funds that go into your apprenticeship services account. So the levy you're paying goes in there, and it's topped up each month by a further 10% by the government. Perhaps not quite so positively, any funds that you don't spend within that account within 24 months disappear back to the Treasury. So you do either need to spend it on apprenticeship training or you would lose access to that funding. And eligible apprentice costs, we'll talk about what eligible means in a minute, in excess of available levy funds will benefit from co-investment as per non-levy paying employers. So again, for the non-levy paying employers in the room, as you'll see in a minute, the government actually want to co-invest with you to assist with the costs of your apprentice training. And we'll talk about how that works in a minute. And as I'm saying there, in the same way, if you're a levy-paying employer, but maybe your pay bill is only just over 3 million, so you don't actually have enough in your levy fund to pay for your apprentice training requirements, then as soon as you've used that money in the account, you tip into the co-investment and you'll be getting government contributions towards the cost of it. And as I say, I'll explain how that works in a minute. Now, very new, from May 2018, 10% of funds will be transferred to pay for one other organisation's eligible apprentice training and assessment costs. So if you are a levy-paying employer and you realise that you can't spend all of your funds, which you now know you're going to lose within 2 years if you don't spend them, then you can actually, if you think of your supply chains, you could actually divert 10% of your levy pot out to just one other company in your supply chain to assist with their apprentice training costs. Right? It's likely, perhaps in future years, that that will change and it will be extended to more than one company, but at the moment, that's the way that it's planned to work. So thinking now about employers that don't pay the levy, and as we've said, this is the majority of employers. So if you don't pay the levy, you don't need to use a digital account to engage with the process. Not yet anyway. So the plan is that by, perhaps optimistically 2018, but maybe a bit further on, eventually non-levy payers will use the digital apprenticeship service account to access the provision. Doesn't mean they'll be paying the levy, it just means they can use that portal to meet their requirements. But at the moment, that's not the case. So for the time being, employers that don't pay the levy can access all of their needs through the Government Apprenticeship Services website. And again, that can be accessed via that address or just simply doing a Google search with apprenticeships in it will get you to that point. And again, your training provider will work very hard to guide you through that process. So I think what we can summarise at the moment is, in terms of engaging with apprentice training, we've now got two types of employer. We've got our levy-paying employer, which, as I've said, is only 2% of all employers, and they will pay for apprentice training from the levy funds through this apprenticeship services account. And then we've got the non-levy payers, the majority, who will use government co-investment to pay for apprentice training. So I guess all importantly, what can apprentice funding be spent on? Right? And this relates to all employers, whether it's money taken from your levy fund or whether it's government co-investment that's been provided to you. Okay, so funds in the digital account and funding provided by the government through co-investment can only be used towards the costs of apprenticeship training and endpoint assessment for apprentices working in England. Right? And there's got to be a minimum of 50% of their time working in England. Okay, now in terms of making the payment, the training and the assessment provider are paid from the employer's apprenticeship service account, if we're talking about a levy-paying employer, or from the employer, only for their co-investment proportion, if they're non-levy paying. All right, I'll talk about the government's proportion of that in a minute. Right, and as we've already said, if training and assessment exceeds the funds in the digital account, or the employer doesn't pay the levy, then co-investment is used up to the ceiling limit set for the apprenticeship. When we come to talk about the co-investment, quite a generous offer, and that is that the employer, so this would be the non-levy paying employer or our levy-based employer who's now exceeded what's in their levy fund, would be expected to make a 10% contribution for the government's 90% contribution. Right, so it's quite a good offer. The important point to note on there, of course, is that that is up to that maximum funding cap that we talked about. So clearly, if you've negotiated with the training provider and it was agreed that a higher price was necessary to deliver the requirements that you had, then you as the employer would pay that over and above. All right, but certainly quite a generous government contribution there up to the funding cap. Right, so if we just think about these funding caps, I'm not going to go through them in detail for individual apprenticeships because I think there's currently around about 400 plus apprenticeships that exist. Obviously, it would make no sense to do that, but that's how the funding bands currently exist. So, as you would expect, the funding band relates to the complexity in delivering the apprenticeship. So clearly, if we were talking about perhaps a fairly basic apprenticeship, perhaps for example, an apprenticeship in warehousing and storage, you would expect to see that down the lower end. And where we're talking about apprenticeships in the STEM subjects, particularly thinking of the advanced apprenticeships and now the higher and graduate level apprenticeships, we would very much expect those to be up towards the right-hand end of that graph, and certainly a lot of the engineering standards from level 3 upwards have now been banded up in band 15. Okay. Now, won't spend too long on this, but it's probably just worth being aware of some funding uplifts that exist. The first one being, if as an employer you take on a young apprentice, an apprentice within the age band of 16 to 18, so somebody that hasn't yet reached their 19th birthday, then the government recognise that perhaps you and the training provider incur slightly higher costs there in supporting that individual. So there is actually a £1,000 uplift, £1,000 gets paid to the employer, £1,000 to the training provider to cover those additional costs. In all other respects, apprenticeships are not age-related. All right, so the funding now, the funding caps we talked about, don't relate to ages. It's purely this uplift for age, and also, again, thinking of the small employers. If you're a small employer that employs less than 50 employees and have done so as an average over the last year, then the government will actually waive the 10% co-investment contribution that you'd be expected to make. Right, so again, obviously quite positive if you're in that category, essentially up to that funding cap rate that we talked about, you would actually get 100% government contribution towards the cost of the apprentice training. All apprenticeships have a minimum requirement in them for maths and English, and if you have any apprentices that you take on that don't already meet that, then there's additional funding and that funding is paid directly to the training provider to deliver that, and it doesn't come out of your levy pot if you're levy paying, or it doesn't require any co-financing on the employer's part. Right. And apprentices that you take on, if they have recognised learning difficulties or disabilities, again, there's some additional funding that's available to support their needs. Not going to go into that in more detail, but just suffice to say that it is there. So I think now at this point, we've really, if you like, gone through the numbers bit, how the funding works, and it's now time to move on to talk about apprenticeships. Can I just ask, we're going to have a question and answer session at the end, so if anybody's got any general questions, it would be probably good to save them until that. But has anybody got any burning question now around the understanding of the levy and how that works? Okay, I'll take silence to be a good sign and move on. So what I'd like to do now is to just consider what an apprenticeship is. And can we just a few ideas around the room? Does anybody, if somebody said to you, what's an apprentice, what sort of things would you say?
Engineering, training.
Okay, so engineering, training, employee. Okay, so
Earning and learning.
Earning and learning, yeah, excellent. Okay, so all really positive things about the apprenticeship scheme. Now, it's worth considering that traditionally, apprenticeships were offered in skilled craft trades and operated on a time-served or an indentured basis. Now, in engineering and manufacturing, which I guess where most of you are from this afternoon, all right, that's really positive. In our sector, we have a really long association with apprenticeships, all right? And over many, many years, they've given a very positive return to employers. Right? But that traditional system over the years has been improved quite significantly. In that traditional approach, one of the downsides of it is that perhaps the apprentice, when they'd finished, their reputation was based very much on the good name of the company they served their apprenticeship with, not so much on the skills, the competencies that they could prove through certification or qualification that they'd gained. So that's been addressed now. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I guess one of the dangers of having this long heritage of apprenticeships is that maybe a lot of people in the industry still think about some real stereotypes when we think about apprentices. Perhaps thinking that an apprentice has to be a young person coming into industry right at the beginning of their career, perhaps somebody that's starting from that low point and going to work up. Perhaps in engineering, we still perhaps talk to employers occasionally that think apprentices would be very much male-dominated, and clearly that's not the case. They're very much open to all. As we've already said, age barriers have been removed. So we're going to come on now to look at today's apprenticeships. And perhaps the first thing to know is that apprenticeships cover a comprehensive range of occupational roles and operate a broad range of industry sectors and a wide range of different levels. And I actually went through the list of current apprenticeships, and I think there's currently about 490 apprenticeships listed across all sectors, and as we said, at different levels. I always think it's a little bit challenging when you try and compare an apprenticeship to a recognised educational academic level. And clearly it has its limitations, but it's probably, just to give us a comparison, quite a good way of thinking about it. So you can see there we've got apprentices starting at level 2, typically intermediate apprenticeships, perhaps sort of equivalent to somebody with perhaps 5 good grade GCSEs. We've then got advanced apprenticeships at level 3, very much covering all the traditional craft trades in engineering, skilled toolmaker, machinist. We've then got our higher apprenticeships, going up from level 4 through to 7, which would be technician engineering roles, perhaps design engineers, and then we've now got the degree apprenticeships, and I know we've got Chichester University here. Can we have a show of hands whoever's from Chichester? Yeah. So we've got Chichester University here who are now becoming very involved in the degree apprenticeships. So we've got coverage now right up to level 7. All right, so the apprenticeship brand is becoming very, very comprehensive in what you can cover. And clearly as an employer, it means that most job roles that you've got will be covered somewhere through those apprenticeship standards that are becoming available, and more are evolving as time goes on. So just thinking then what an apprenticeship must contain. So an apprentice must have a written contract of employment and a commitment statement. So somebody said earlier on, apprentices must be employed, and it's absolutely fundamental. So an apprentice is an employed role. An apprentice must receive appropriate pay. Right, and clearly there's minimum apprenticeship rates. I would suggest very much, certainly the employers that we work with across Surrey and Sussex in engineering, I don't think we've got any apprentices that start out on the minimum apprentice rate. I see this very much as a commitment to meet a business need. You know, we would certainly advocate realistic pay for apprentices. An apprentice will undertake an agreed training standard or a framework. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go into individual apprenticeship frameworks or standards, but suffice to say, apprenticeship frameworks are the documents we've had around for quite some time, which set out all of the requirements that an apprentice in that sector has to meet to become nationally recognised. Frameworks are now being phased out, and they're being replaced by apprenticeship standards, which again define, through the apprenticeship standard and the assessment plan that goes with it, define the requirements that an apprentice in that sector carrying out that occupation has to meet in order to become qualified and certificated as an apprentice at the end of the programme. And also, really importantly, where government funding is going into it, then there's a mandatory requirement that the apprentice works to one of those frameworks or standards. The apprentice is going to work with experienced staff, and really one of the absolute benefits of apprenticeships, right, in industry, we've got all these talented people, and for the apprentice to be able to work alongside them, for them to pass skills across, it really is a fantastic opportunity. It's going to enable them to learn job-specific skills, which of course from an employer's point of view means that they're going to be business-relevant skills. And the apprentice is going to be required to study during the working week. And again, in the engineering manufacturing sector, where you're going to combine practical hands-on ability with the need for a high level of knowledge, right, being able to bring those two things together, again, gives us an awful lot of synergy to make the whole learning experience so much more positive. The apprentice is going to achieve required qualifications. Now, it's true to say that in some apprenticeship standards, the need for specific qualifications has been taken out, and the measure of competence all comes at the endpoint assessment stage, which we'll talk about briefly in a minute. But for the purposes of this, and certainly in the engineering sector, the majority of apprenticeships you come across still have a requirement, I think quite rightly, for qualifications to be embedded into it. Right. And particularly as we move towards apprenticeship standards, there's much, much more emphasis on the development of behaviours, the behaviours that are required to make that individual a well-rounded employee in their particular occupation. We've already said that all apprenticeships, that there's a minimum requirement for maths and English. Now, really interesting point, and perhaps a point that is still missed by many, many employers, is that the new system allows you to consider apprentices who could be new employees, or they could be existing employees that are moving into a significantly new job role. Right? So if they're an existing employee, you still have to make sure that you can meet all of the criteria that's on the right. So we're clearly not talking about perhaps somebody that needs to go on a short machine manufacturer's training course, but where you're moving somebody from one job role into another, then it's quite acceptable and quite beneficial to consider how the apprenticeship scheme might be used in order to achieve that. We should also say that apprentices are typically required to work a minimum of 30 hours a week. And if they're working that number of hours, an apprenticeship, depending on the level of it and the complexity, could range anything between 1 and 5 years. Some apprentices in some job roles and occupations might not be able to work 30 hours a week. That is allowed, but where they're working less hours, then the overall duration of the apprenticeship has to be increased proportionally. But minimum of 30 hours would be the norm. Okay, we're nearly at the end of the presentation, but just worth mentioning about standards-based apprenticeships, because as I've said, the apprenticeship standards are now taking over from the apprenticeship frameworks, and the way that that programme would work, very much an individual or an employer would identify that they have an apprentice training need. I would advocate at that point they engage with the training provider, and we would go through the initial assessment process, assessing that the job that the employer has got is a good fit for the apprenticeship and it's right for the employer. Also, having a thorough initial assessment of potential applicants that are coming into the apprenticeship. Once they're selected and the programme started, they would then go through a stage of on-programme training and development. And as we said, depending on the apprenticeship, that could be anything from a 1 to a 5 year programme. And that may involve the acquisition of qualifications along the way. Will probably in our sector involve the apprentice attending off-the-job training, perhaps in a local college, graduate level in the university, and that will sit alongside the development that's being undertaken in the company, all supported by the training officer who will make that process happen, carry out the regular monitoring of the apprentices, and provide the assessment for the on-the-job qualifications where they're required. When we then get to the point where it's believed that the apprentice has met all of those challenges and they're now competent, and importantly the employer believes they're competent, they then pass through a gateway process which gets them to what I talked about earlier as independent endpoint assessment. Now, the actual arrangements for that will differ depending on the apprenticeship standard that's being used. In some cases, if it's an apprenticeship that's very qualifications-based, then that might be effectively a validation of the process that they've gone through, plus perhaps a telephone interview with the apprentice. In other standards, it will actually require an independent endpoint assessor to actually come on site and assess the apprentice carrying out the range of activities that they normally would. When that stage has been achieved, then again with engagement with the employer, we're ready to apply for the completion certification and to move the whole process forward for certification, hopefully arriving at a fully occupationally competent individual who should then be able to carry out effectively the role that the apprenticeship set out to achieve, and also have a broad range of transferable skills which will be very useful to them if it's decided that it's appropriate for them to progress on to higher levels. Okay, so thinking about this question, well, how are you going to decide if apprentices are right for you? I think that actually that's very much down to your business needs. And what we would say to employers very, very strongly is only consider taking on apprentices if you can make a good business justification for why you would want them in your organisation. All right? Don't do it just because you pay the levy. All right? Clearly, you want to get some of that money back. And if you decide that you have a good business need to train an apprentice, then clearly being able to utilise the money in the levy or the government's co-financing is a great asset to help you do that. But it's really the business need for these apprentices going into real jobs that have meaningful outcomes that is going to benefit you as the employer and benefit the individual apprentice. Now, talking to employers, they would just be some of the reasons that they would cite for why they think it's beneficial for them to take on apprentices. Right? And we can add many more to that list. Right? But I think perhaps they're some of the key ones. And not least of all, as I've already said, this synergy of being able to bring an apprentice into a real work situation, which clearly in the engineering and manufacturing sector often means they're going to get access to state-of-the-art technology, new processes, new thinking, which they wouldn't be able to access through further education alone. And of course we're linking that with the input from further education to give them the knowledge that they actually need to apply to that working situation. So I'm an ex-apprentice myself, going back many years, and I think, you know, in the role I've got now, where we work extensively with apprentices, we've seen many individuals come through the programme that have actually gone on to be really good assets to their employer. They've sustained employment with that organisation after their apprenticeship and have gone on to take on more senior roles. So I think it's proved itself as a method of giving people a really good grounding into the roles that we've got. And I think it's true in all sectors, but I mean, I speak from the point of view of engineering and manufacturing. Okay, so how to get started? Very simple message, I've already said it. I would say find a training provider. Get that conversation going early on, because I think, you know, unless you're an employer that has thrown a huge resource at investigating apprenticeships, actually building that link early on will actually help you to navigate your way through the process. And as I've already said, there's links for you to do that on the government website to find apprenticeship training. In Sussex, we're very fortunate, we've got a strong training provider network through the Sussex Council of Training Providers. And again, through that link, you'll find lists of all the local Sussex-based training providers. And of course, it's likely that you may be having that conversation with more than one training provider, because often you'll find that you might want to select a provider who's a specialist in a particular occupational area, and they may be ideal for delivering that range of apprenticeships. You know, and for example, if you think of things as extreme as, let's say, your engineering and manufacturing apprenticeships, maybe you want an apprentice in your accounting department, it's quite likely that you'll want different organisations with specialisms to deliver that. So clearly, the choice is yours as employers, but get that conversation going early. Okay. And then just a list of things that the training provider will be able to do to help you. And I think we've already talked about most of those. The one that perhaps is worth talking about there, just very briefly, is recruiting apprentices, because the training provider should be able to give you a lot of support in finding your finding your apprentices. What I would say is remember as employers that there is a lot of competition out there. Not just competition from other good employers, but competition from the schools wanting to push young people through sixth form colleges and going down the university route. Some really good offers down that route for young people. So think about as an employer how you can really market yourself as an organisation that can offer something very, very positive to new entrants coming in via the apprenticeship route. Right? And of course, don't forget that apprenticeships don't just have to be new entrants into the industry, you could be looking at using it to upskill and retrain existing employees. Really emphasising that point, the training provider is going to provide that support throughout the whole apprenticeship journey, right from that initial assessment of whether it's the right programme for you, through to that final certification of the apprentice. Right. What I'd like to do now, we've actually reached the end of the presentation. I'm conscious that I've run over by a few minutes, but I think I had permission to do that, is to just show you a short video. It only runs for about 4 minutes, and it's just of some of the apprentices that we manage, and it's just those apprentices talking about their experience. It's probably worth emphasising that one of the questions that we asked them to think about when they appeared on this video is why they decided to go down the apprenticeship route as opposed to going to university. All right, so when you hear some of them make a comment about that, just want to emphasise that neither SIGTA nor the apprentices are saying that university couldn't be a good route to follow. They're just simply saying that for them, they thought that the apprenticeship was the best route to go down. But I think you can think about how some of their thoughts and the benefits they're getting from it could translate into benefits that you as the employer would get from delivering it to those people, and the type of candidate, the type of employee you're going to end up with at the end. So let me see if this runs.
Because it allowed me to earn a salary while I'm working and gaining knowledge. There's lots of aspects to my job. We work in lots of systems, hydraulics, visual systems, aircraft systems, electronics, lots of software involved. So I cover a lot of aspects of engineering. The apprenticeship has allowed me now to travel the world. I'm looking to go to China at the end of the year and work out there for a year. It's brought all sorts of new opportunities and allowed me to develop and grow. If you're considering taking an apprenticeship, I would 100% go and ask for more information, because it was what's out there and what's available.
For me, the most enjoyable aspect of apprenticeship was it was very exciting coming to work every day, getting involved with practical work, working with really great people here. A lot of people know they are the best in the industry, very experienced, and I really enjoyed that. Not only I was getting college qualifications, but I was putting that qualification and knowledge into practice at work, and I think I really enjoyed that.
I chose the apprenticeship route rather than going to university because I wanted the experience of actually working in a work environment, and I wanted to work my way up. And I don't think that university could have offered me the opportunity to gain the skills that I've gained during the time I've worked here. One of the aspects I've really enjoyed is the different departments I've had the opportunity to work in. I've moved around from just like manufacturing to instrumentation and control, which is really, really interesting. And it's meant that now in the department I'm in, I can use the skills that I've learned and put it into practice when I'm doing that work, which is really good. I think it's really important that engineering isn't just seen as being a dirty environment, and it's not just using scanners and tools. It can be really, really high tech and really scientific.
When I first left secondary school, I was a bit unsure about it. I'd already been on a programme where you could sort of preview universities and try them out, and I just decided it wasn't for me. None of my family had been to university, and one of them had actually done an apprenticeship, and I spoke to him about it. And in the end, I found my way onto the government's apprenticeship website, which is how I found about this role initially. I looked into it a bit further, and I thought this actually might be what I want to do. The most enjoyable aspect of my apprenticeship is going to college, learning the theory, and then coming back into the workplace and putting it into practice and actually relating the two together, and you actually feel you are learning something through the programme.
Working with the teams that we have with Ricardo here, it's a really good family atmosphere. It's one of the things that makes you actually want to come to work every day and really enjoy it. And you get to incorporate the educational side of things with the hands-on experience. A lot of guys go off to university, but when they actually come into the industry, they haven't had any of that hands-on experience, whereas we actually get that day to day.
Engineering is a very practical subject, and an apprenticeship offers one of the best ways to learn the skills required to become an engineer. My SIGTA training officer, I meet with him every 6 weeks and he checks through all my MBQ work and helps me with any problems that I have.
For my first 2 years of my apprenticeship, I've sort of done a rotation around the site and worked in lots of different departments. So because I'm going into engine design, I've sort of worked in lots of departments that are relevant to that. I've done engine building and engine stripping. I've done analysis departments like CFD and structural analysis. I've also worked in machine shop and inspection. I've worked in a whole range of departments across site really. If you were considering an apprenticeship, I would get in touch with SIGTA and just see what apprenticeships they have to offer and see what you're suited to. So there's quite a vast range of apprenticeships in lots of different industries, so there's bound to be something that's quite appealing to you. It's quite a nice alternative to uni if you want a more hands-on approach to learning, a more practical way of doing things.
Okay, well that brings me to the end of what I wanted to say. I hope that video was interesting, just seeing some of those apprentices in action and obviously some of the great opportunities that they're getting. I'm going to be around for the rest of the meeting. Also got my colleague Darren Kingshot sitting at the table there, who is one of our training officers that actually works in the companies with some of our apprentices. So again, if you've got any questions that you want to ask us at the end of the session, please do come and talk to us. And clearly we've got other training providers in the room who I'm sure would also be very happy to talk to you. Can we just have a quick show of hands in the training providers, just so that people know who you are? Yeah, excellent, okay. And again, my contact details are up there, so if after this session you've got any other questions or queries, then please don't hesitate to contact us. We're always happy to help.
Brilliant. John, thank you very much. Round of applause.